So hello there and welcome to another episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast. Once again, my name is Adam Burns and joining me on this episode of the podcast, fan favourite as usual, Mr. Courtney I. Courtney, how are you this evening? Are you doing good?
Good evening, ladies and gents. Yeah, I'm good. It just feels like we're pretty much back to normality now. Don't want to get too carried away, but we've been getting our sporting fix lately.
Yeah,
and we've had three races now, haven't we? Like it almost feels like we're already deep into a season and we have so many things to talk about already. So it feels like normal and it feels great.
Yeah, it's becoming a weekly occurrence. Of course, there's no race this weekend. The first gap in the season. Of course, we'll be talking about some other updates that I've been hearing on the rumour mill regarding the future events. We've got 10 so far, maybe a few more to add to that list, but we'll get to that later on. But got to talk about a big milestone for us, Courtney. It's episode number 20 of the DNF1 podcast. Yeah, it's brilliant. 20 episodes in. And
going strong, may I say.
It's absolutely flown by. I mean, granted that we've only had pre-season testing, a lot of filler episodes, a lot of good ones I might add as well. So definitely check those out if you're new to this podcast. But
well plugged.
of course. But 20 episodes in and we're well into the season now. The open first few early races, if you like, are well underway now. And we're starting to see the picture of the 2020 championship reveal itself before our eyes at the moment. So before we get into that, obviously because we're now up to episode number 20, we just want to have a little bit of a shameless cheeky plug for you lovely lot. So a few episodes ago you would have noticed, a few of you eagle-eyed, that we advertised a little snippet or a clip of a beginner's guide to Formula 1 racing. Now this is something that has been requested to us from a lot of fans, new and old, about an opportunity for us to describe the basics of Formula 1 and the essentials that we personally feel that you guys would appreciate and need to know in order to enjoy Formula 1 racing as much as we do. And so as a result of this, we've worked very, very hard and prepared our first proper video, if you like, and that will be going live on the YouTube channel on Friday morning, so make sure to check that out. And of course, if you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that notifications bell, and you will be able to see that video as soon as it goes live. So that's this Friday, the 22nd of July. I think it's the 20th today. Just checking my calendar, make sure oh no, it's 23rd, excuse me. Oh no,
yeah, 21st today.
21st today, so sorry, excuse me, I'm terrible, can't get my dates right. So that's Friday the 24th of July. Make sure I got that right. So Friday 24th of July. Make sure to check out the YouTube channel, DNF1 F1 Podcast there. You can't miss it. And it will be a beginner's guide to to Formula 1 racing from DNF1. And it's in two parts. So this will be part 1. And hopefully part 2 might be available the Friday afterwards. Or perhaps the following weekend. We'll have to see. But make sure to check that out. And of course, let us know what you think. Make sure to like, share that video. Try and make it go viral if you can. Would really appreciate that. And obviously, leave a comment, say hi, and let us know what you think. So, that shameless plug out of the way. Of course, we're very excited about that, but let's crack on to the main topics now. Now, of course, the news at hand, Courtney. Hungarian Grand Prix this weekend. Another interesting race for different reasons. And of course, once again, one thing that does seem to remain constant, the champ, Lewis Hamilton, once again, showing everybody who's boss and getting that big fat W under his belt once again. The 86th win of his career, the second of the season, which catapults him to the top of the Drivers' Championship.
After a rusty start in his first race at Austria, it was pretty obvious he was getting distracted. There was a lot of politics going on, wasn't there? He was getting targeted by. He's just got straight into the groove after that. After that minor setback, straight into the groove. And I'd like to touch on what you mentioned previously, that after going to two different types of circuits, we're now getting an idea of how the pecking order is turning out. And if you're a non-Mercedes fan, it's pretty ominous because, you know, Austria is a little bit more power hungry. So, you know, non-Mercedes fans might have gone, well, we're going to a circuit which isn't as reliant on power. And they might do, the pack might get closer together, but blimey. And so when I saw those qualifying results, I thought, it's my phrase recently, it's a 2014 to 2016 feeling all over again.
Yeah, it started to be quite ominous in that regard. And you're absolutely right to point out qualifying, Courtney. I was just going to reference that. For those of you that haven't seen, obviously in qualifying, Mercedes were well out in front of everybody else. The only car that got anywhere near them was Racing Point, and even then they were a second behind. But the most memorable moment of qualifying was when both Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton went through turn 4 round Hungary, which is a sharp left-hander, which most drivers would usually drop a gear, sometimes 2 gears in the older Formula 1 cars, lay off the throttle temporarily just to keep the car stable, and then put your foot straight on to make sure you don't lose any speed. Keep it nice and flowing onto the left-hand side for turn 5. But the Mercedes, both of them, went in there, didn't lift their foot off the throttle at all, and stayed in 7th gear. It was absolutely incredible. One of the most difficult corners on the Formula 1 calendar for a lot of different reasons, and they almost made it into a straight. It's quite frightening how good that car really is, and I think for the first time this season we really got to see what kind of gulf that exists between Mercedes and the rest of the field. And I gotta say, if we weren't thinking we had those 2014-16 vibes before, they certainly are there now, maybe even stronger than they were before. So quite scary.
Yeah, because even during the race, like Lewis was about, well, before he pitted towards the end, he had a free pit stop, didn't he? Because he was 25 seconds ahead of Max.
Yes.
You always sense that they've got time in hand, regardless of how far ahead they were. So I don't know. Well, if they were in a certain mode and Max started to catch up a bit, I don't know, like a second or so, they'll just go into a different mode. They are literally cruising. And to be honest, I was surprised that Bottas didn't get the overtake on Verstappen, even though we know he rings everything he can out of the car. I was surprised that Bottas didn't get the overtake because it's pretty obvious, you know, particularly in qualifying, how far ahead the Mercedes is. I mean, you know, I'm saying this lightheartedly, but it seems that the pack are behind last year's Mercedes, let alone this year's.
Well, I think this is by evidence of what Racing Point are doing, and the same old joke about them obviously having very, very similar hallmarks to the W10 that Mercedes ran last year, their championship-winning car from 2019. And the fact that Racing Point seemed to be the next fastest car, even around Hungary, was quite ominous as well. So it's an interesting point you make about Valtteri Bottas. I think the caveat that you would throw in favour to support Valtteri Bottas in this instance would be that whilst the Mercedes is notoriously quick, almost scary how fast they are when they're out in front, there's always been that tendency with them to struggle to overtake cars or to follow cars. And I think in the nature of Formula 1, when you've got the fastest car or the car that's the most aerodynamically efficient, you do tend to have that trade-off where you do struggle to follow other cars, at least in the current era. Hopefully by 2022, when the new regulations kick in, that will be a thing of the past, which will definitely be music to Mercedes' ears, assuming they can build a car similar in terms of dominance to what they have right now. But well, of course, we'll worry about that then. But importantly, what it does do, Courtney, is it allows Lewis Hamilton to extract the absolute maximum required from his race and get the win and the fastest lap, almost completing the Grand Slam with the exclusion of practice, although that really, to me, isn't too relevant. I think pole, race, win and fastest lap are suitable enough. And he did that once again, and of course that now moves into the top of the championship for the first time this season, and we're already starting to see the odd error and the odd mistake from Valtteri Bottas. And of course I'm referring to the jump start controversy. Now, from what I understand of that incident, looking into that, I felt it was a pretty slam dunk penalty for the jump start. It just seemed that on the video evidence that we had that Valtteri Bottas's Mercedes started to roll before the lights had gone out, and even though he had stopped and compromised his start, he jumped the start, which normally would be a 10-second stop and go penalty or a drive-through penalty, either which would be the best part of 20 or 30 seconds, whichever one it would have been. And of course, that wouldn't have made a difference to his overall position. He would have still come third if they'd have added the time penalty. But nonetheless, there is a precedent that needs to be enforced here. Now, what did you think of it, Courtney? Did you think that was a penalty?
Well, the defence is that even though he moved forward, he didn't go past the white line. And I don't know if the stewards considered that, he did lose a few places at the start. And I'm just wondering, if he hadn't lost places at the start, maybe they would have given him a penalty.
Possibly. My only criticism of that sort of response, and of course if that's their defence, the only criticism of that defence is we're basically judging a jump start on the premise that a driver has whether they've gained an advantage or not, which isn't what a jump start is all about. Now, of course, I'm looking through the F1 terminology here on their website or on their app. And it's a good app. It does give you a lot of information on this, so I definitely recommend those of you that haven't downloaded it to definitely have a look. But according to the F1 app and the F1 website, based on the rules governed by the FIA, a jump start is defined as when a driver moves off his grid position before the 5 red lights have been switched off to signal the start, and sensors detect premature movement, and a jump start earns a driver a penalty. Now, Matt Macy, the race director replacing Charlie Whiting from last season, of course, he referenced the sensors, and he said that, of course, we had the data with Mercedes, the sensors did not pick up any premature movement, and therefore we could not administer a penalty. Now, the problem with that is, and he claimed that this is something they've used for a long time, and of course we had the incident with Valtteri back in Austria in 2017 where he had the almost perfect getaway, almost too true, and it seemed for all the while that there was no way he could get it right without guessing. Now, of course, with the jump start regulations, they do have a bit of a threshold where a driver can't possibly react beyond a certain time threshold.
Yeah. Meaning
that if they do react within that time threshold, it's a guess and therefore a jump start. Now, of course, that wasn't punished back then. Cast your own opinion on that if you like. But since then, for me, I find it strange that we're relying on sensors when we can see video evidence that Valtteri had moved. And under the terminology of a jump start, regardless whether they use the sensors or not, Valtteri does move before the lights go out. And as a result of that, regardless of whether he's behind his grid slot and should move in, he has jumped the start. The only reason, as you said, Courtney, rightly pointed out, that has saved him on this occasion is because he stopped and lost so many places. But for me, I don't think that's suitable enough. That's kind of like saying, you've crashed into, like an extreme example as a metaphor, you've had a crash with someone deliberately and took them out of the race, but it's okay because you were both 18th and 19th in the race.
So I'm guessing you just want some consistency on the matter.
I just think there's going to be an occasion where another driver, maybe Bottas in the future, who knows, does the same thing, will get a penalty, because you always get drivers with jump starts, and then people will be crying, well, why didn't Bottas get this? Where's the consistency? Now, Kimi Raikkonen got a penalty for his conduct on the grid, and that was a different thing, because I remember reading someone brought Kimi Raikkonen's penalty up. The reason Kimi Raikkonen got a penalty was because he parked his car in the wrong grid slot. Of course, he was starting in the wrong position, and the reason this had happened was because he was starting at the back, and the two Hasses went into the pits, and Raikkonen ended up putting his car in the wrong grid slot. Now, of course, Kimi's not used to starting at the back, even in the Alpha.
No, he's not.
But he got a penalty for his conduct. So I just want to see some consistency, and I felt like the FIA had made a mistake on their decision, or the stewards had, and their defence was blaming the technology, saying, oh, the sensors messed up, or the sensors didn't pick up the movement, because the video cameras saw it, and usually in other decisions, in other incidents, video evidence seems to be suitable enough, so I'm not sure why that's not the case in this incident. But that's my personal opinion on it. I just want to see a bit more consistency with these decisions. So moving on to the next part, of course, we've mentioned a lot Mercedes and, of course, how brilliant they've been. I think before we go any further, do we feel that this is already a two-driver championship, Courtney?
I mean, you don't want to get too carried away after, 3 races, but it's very rare, where you'll see, shall we say, the second place team close the amount of time that there is between Mercedes and Red Bull right now over the course of a season. They've got to close. You're looking about a second a lap right now, and it's really difficult. For those who know F1, they'll know that it's very difficult to close in that much time over the course of a season with, upgrades. And particularly in the engine sense, it seems that Mercedes, who were the original benchmark for the engine, they fell back the past season or so, but it just seems they've just gone full steam ahead with it, and they're just so far ahead in the engine department again.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why that seems to be the case, and of course we'll go into that a little bit later on in this episode because it is an important thing to mention, and I have a theory of why this is the case, but we'll cover that later on. But moving on to Red Bull, I think we're both in agreement that despite Racing Point's heroics, Red Bull arguably still have the next best car. It's just a case of being able to find that sweet spot to actually extract the maximum, because I don't think you and I believe that they've done that yet. I think that's been their struggle this season. Yeah. They certainly haven't digressed. They've just struggled to find that sweet spot where they can get,
It's a very twitchy car, and over the course of a season, I think it's going to cause them problems. It's very erratic. I think that's probably the way to describe it.
Yeah, I think
it's got the performance is all over the place. It can just spin randomly. Like the warm-up lap by Max, I know it's in wet conditions, but that was a bizarre incident. And for me, I don't know. Do you know what? The best way to describe the car is probably a little bit Bambi on ice. You're right, there seems to be like this perfect spot, and if it isn't in that perfect spot, a little bit like, like an F1 car on slicks, and has to stick on, that race line, or if it touches a wet patch, it's going to spin. It's almost as if the Red Bull is a bit like that.
Well, we covered this in pre-season testing, and I think if you cast your minds back to one of the first few episodes of the podcast, Courtney, we talked about how the Red Bull will quite often spin at high speeds, trying to throw itself into corners, as Max so often likes to do, and Alex Albon to an extent. They do drive as if they want to throw their car into corners, and that's always a good thing. And we felt there was an imbalance in the rear downforce. We felt that they were carrying too much. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with how the downforce works on a car and why the balance is significant, of course, you can apply as much downforce to the car as you want. But if you apply an imbalance having too much front downforce, then the car is going to oversteer. The back end's going to be loose. It's going to be great at the front, but the rear end is going to be loose. It's not going to grip. So you won't be able to get on the power on the exit. Whereas in Red Bull's case, what they have is perhaps too much rear downforce where the rear of the car's thrown in, but it just won't bite.
Yeah.
And it ends up spinning around quite easily at high speeds. It just can't control it mid-corner and end up in a bit of a tank slapper. And it does seem that still is happening for Red Bull in practice. Not so much in the race, but definitely in practice. And the car does seem to be difficult from a drivability perspective. We know Max likes to extract the absolute maximum out of the car, and we definitely believe he's doing that. But right now, he seems very frustrated in his language. Yep. He's very much on the defensive. It's almost like he's realises already this season, despite all the hope and all the ambition that perhaps pre-season testing had given Red Bull, Mercedes, whether they were hiding their pace or they found even more in the time off owing to COVID, they're now in a position where that Red Bull is no longer capable of challenging Mercedes on a regular basis until they actually find that sweet spot and improve the car. And it's frustrating for Max, because another year...
Yeah, because you can't blame him, really, because a lot of people, including ourselves, are saying this could be the year that he could challenge for his first World Championship.
Well, I said,
yeah. Yeah. That was your call, and I don't want to call it off just yet. Despite what I just said, you don't want to be unwise of me to say, it's 100% done, because we all know that's not how sport works. You know, there could be mechanical issues for Mercedes that put them straight back into the championship. But in terms of raw pace, they are, generally speaking, over the course of the season, I feel they're going to be way behind. And it must be frustrating for Max, because, you know, am I right in saying that if he doesn't get it this season, he'll lose that youngest world champion status? Because that's what he's been after, really, hasn't he? That's been the main thing.
Yes.
He wanted to beat Vettel's record.
I think, yes, it might. I have to check myself, but I believe, yes, this is the last year that either he or Charles Leclerc can achieve that milestone of being the youngest world champion that Sebastian Vettel still currently holds, and for all intents and purposes looks very much likely to continue with that. Obviously, I think the only driver left in the field outside of them is Lando Norris that can achieve that, which the way he's been driving, you can never rule that out with Lando at the moment. He seems to be improving quite a lot. But yeah, and I think with Red Bull, it is a big problem they have to answer, and I think this brings us nicely towards the Alex Albon situation, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit before we go to the break. But Alex Albon, of course, qualified outside the top 10, struggling for pace. In Q2, he complained on both occasions that he got stuck out behind the Ferraris and got stuck in traffic, and it cost him a lot of time. And it certainly seemed that way, that the traffic he faced on a track like Hungary, where the turbulent air and the weight can really cost you a lot of time if you're put out in traffic in Hungary, more so than other tracks. It really does. And drivers can feel this from as far back as 2.5 to 3 seconds behind the car ahead. That's how powerful the turbulent air can be for a Formula 1 car. But what was interesting about that is Red Bull are a team that's usually very, very efficient in their strategy and how they're able to get their drivers in those sweet situations where they're able to get the most out of the car without any impositions. But for poor Alex, it's not been the easiest start to the season for him. And Red Bull aren't doing him any favours. And I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So if you are a Red Bull fan, I do appreciate, obviously, if you're not happy with what I'm about to say, but it does seem to me that perhaps we are starting to see once again that this Red Bull team cannot handle having two quick drivers. And by that I mean they have Max Verstappen, who is an extremely talented driver, world championship material, absolutely, but has never really had the car to do that. And the team, like so many teams in the past that have been successful, have diverted all their resources in his basket to give him the best platform possible. Now, as a result of that, over the last couple of years since Max has been in that team, he's had 3 or 4 different teammates now. I think Alex is his third, actually, in fairness. And once again, we're starting to see a talented driver in Alex Albon starting to question his team, not able to deliver the performances that they want, at least in qualifying, because in the race he did a good job to get 5th place. But it's starting to seem once again that Red Bull are diverting their attention towards Max rather than realising actually we've got 2 drivers, we need to show Alex a bit more love, and making him look a bit of a fool, especially in qualifying.
Well, yeah, you know, I always felt that them losing Ricciardo was a big loss. And we all know that's why he left. We all know that he knew that, you know, he wasn't the main man at Red Bull, you know, and let's be honest with Red Bull, this isn't the first time they've done this. They do like to have a golden boy. Like, there's one thing having a number 1 driver, and we all know that some teams have that. But they're very, very open. Like, it was very much the case with Vettel and Webber. That, you know, that Vettel was the golden boy, he was the poster boy of Red Bull, and it does seem like the same thing's happening with Verstappen. And we saw Ricciardo, he had some great drives. See, like in the right car, Ricciardo could challenge for a championship, and they didn't make him feel like he stood a chance. You know, if Red Bull had a championship winning car, he knew that they wouldn't give him what he needed because they'd be giving the resources to Verstappen, and that's why he left. And you're right, it just seems like the same thing's starting to happen with Albon. Albon isn't really being given a fair chance to spread his wings, to be honest, and that wasn't pun intended. But yeah, they haven't. Like, it's a shame to see, because you've got this kind of this golden generation who kind of, raced each other in karting. Norris, Russell, obviously Albon and Leclerc, and the rest of them are getting, even Russell in a weird way, getting performances out of a poor car, generally speaking. And Albon hasn't had the chance to make the headline yet. I know he's close to getting to a couple of podiums, but he's very much in the shadow of Verstappen at Red Bull. And, people around the paddock and the general public are starting to notice it now.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult place to exist in, a very difficult place to get out of as well, as we've seen. Of course, Daniel Ricciardo leaving Red Bull a couple of years ago to join Renault. That was a huge bombshell, but the reasoning was quite sound under the circumstances. And of course, Pierre Gasly as well, who drove very, very well for Toro Rosso as it was back then, got the promotion into Red Bull and really, really struggled. And I think one real eye-opener for me was watching the Drive to Survive documentary that Netflix made on that season. And it was quite telling how much Red Bull, as difficult as it was for Gasly, and it's a real pressure cooker. You have to be able to live in that environment to survive as a top-level driver, and perhaps Gasly...
He was breaking mentally. You got it spot on. Like, you can just tell. You can tell by his demeanour that he was almost mentally broken by what was going on at Red Bull.
Yeah, I don't think he received the right level of support. It was almost like, yeah, things are difficult, we get that. But especially when he moved on, it was almost like there was being made a mockery of him, almost made fun of him. And for me, I mean, forgive any sort of bias if you like, but that just doesn't resonate well with me in terms of how you should be getting the most out of your drivers. And of course, now Gasly's gone back to AlphaTauri now it is. Of course, last season he got that podium in Brazil, and he's driving very, very well. He's driving very, very well. The best I've seen him drive in a good couple of years. And I feel like Franz Tost is able to put that arm around someone like Pierre Gasly, because we know he's quick. He's a former GP2 champion, and we know he can do well. So hopefully for Gasly that continues. And of course for Alex Albon, as George Russell quite rightly pointed out in his interview after qualifying, that Alex was made to look a fool there. And we know Alex is a very quick team, and perhaps Red Bull need to show him a little bit more love and perhaps realise, not that he said this, but implying that Red Bull have to realise they have two drivers. This isn't the Max Verstappen show. And I don't mean that as a criticism of Max in particular. Max wants to build that team around him, as Hamilton does with Mercedes and Charles Leclerc have done with Ferrari, like Vettel before him. You need that, but you have two drivers for a reason. So hopefully in Alex's case, he can get that support he needs, improve his performance, and that will only help Red Bull as well in their quest.
Do you reckon Max Verstappen's fan base has a little bit to do with that? Because as we know, as crazy it is to see, we do know that Max does have a very large and intense fan base.
Yeah, I think so. No, I think he does, and it definitely does, because from a business perspective, and we don't tend to use this very often on this podcast, but there are Formula One fans that will support teams like myself, and I think it's fair to say, Courtney, that I don't know if you still are, but you used to be one of those fans that would support a particular driver.
That's right, yeah.
And we can talk about entertain certain scenarios where if one driver went to another team, we'll just support them. And that's something that happens in Formula One. You do tend more often than not to get fans that support the driver. And there's no doubt in my mind that if Max Verstappen went to a Ferrari or a Mercedes or even a Racing Point or Aston Martin, his legions of fans from Holland and around the world would most likely follow him elsewhere. And Red Bull are aware of this. I mean, could you imagine going to the Red Bull ring and all of a sudden all them Dutch fans that once supported Max are now wearing Ferrari tops or Mercedes tops, or, well, they wouldn't, they'd be wearing orange shirts, but nonetheless, it's the same thing. And Red Bull know this. So absolutely. And Christian Horner pointed this out, that they are in a precarious position where they have a top quality driver. And if they don't provide him with the tools he needs, they're going to lose him. This happened with Sebastian Vettel. All right, he had a fondness for Ferrari and always wanted to emulate the Michael Schumacher scenario. But Max Verstappen, it's the same thing. His aspirations are to win world championships. And absolutely, there's no doubt in my mind that if he cannot get it at Red Bull and he can get it somewhere else, after a while he will try to manifest or manufacture a move elsewhere. So
I personally feel that regardless, I feel that Max Verstappen will be the guy to replace Lewis when he retires. I think that's what will happen, and I'm sure Red Bull are aware that Lewis could retire the next 2, maybe 3 seasons. So they know they're in a race again. Sorry, pun unintended. They are in a race against time with Max.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think we should use this as an opportunity now to take a break, and we will come back and we will discuss a few more teams. Of course, what's going on at Racing Point. Obviously, the Ferrari situation, how that's changed, and cover a few other important incidents for the Hungarian Grand Prix. So make sure to come back in the next few minutes, and we will return for part 2. So hello and welcome back to the second part of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And just off the air, Courtney and I were having an interesting chat there. Almost forgot that we weren't recording. So we'll bring it right around to what we were talking about, and that was Racing Point. So, God, the Racing Point seemed to be the talk of the paddock since pre-season testing, of course, once again, with their version, if you like, of the 2019 Mercedes W10 that they are running as the RP20. Now, of course, we know that through listed standard parts that they've purchased, which are within the rules, and of course they've admitted countless times to making observations and taking photos of the Mercedes from last season and designing their own version, as they claim, which is currently being investigated, of course, to the point where in some cases, Courtney, it's fair to say they have the second fastest car in some regards at the moment.
Well, yeah, it seems particularly in qualifying. In Hungary, they were way ahead of the rest of the pack, and I mean, I have mixed opinions on it. It's nice to see another team in the fold. You know, it's not just Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari taking up the top 6. I do like to see a bit of a mix up there. But I do understand the sentiment of a lot of fans that this car seems to be way too similar to last year's Mercedes. So I can understand why there is some kind of resentment towards it. But you want to see new teams in the mix, but I don't know. You want to see it done in a certain way, don't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, if Racing Point are found to have not broken the rules and all they've basically done is take photos and observations and use intellectual property that was legal in previous years to design their car now, then quite honestly that's a genius move when you think about the state of play in Formula 1 at the moment, where the plan was to only have 1 year of these regulations before the 2021 rules came into fruition. Now, of course, we've got that held back until 2022, meaning that if this didn't work out for them, they would only suffer for a year. But the fact that it's worked for them so well, they've effectively got a very strong car for 2 seasons at least. So it's all fine and well. But as you mentioned quite rightly, it's almost too fast. It's almost too much of an improvement. Now, of course, the caveat to this is that Ferrari and Red Bull, relatively speaking, have regressed, although their cars are certainly faster than what they have last year, because obviously they'd be running last year's cars if they were faster than this year's ones, which they're not. So impressive showing from them again. Of course, 3rd and 4th in qualifying. They ran mediums, the slower tyres, in Quali 2, because of course that was meant to be the race tyre, but they didn't get to use that because of the wet conditions at the start of the race. But I've got to say, it does seem a little bit strange what's going on with that investigation. It hasn't been swept away by the FIA. Now, why I mentioned this and why this is significant, I did talk about this last week, so I won't go into it like I did then. But Nicholas Tombasis, who is basically the policeman, if you like, of the FIA, basically has all the designs of the cars that are submitted to him before the season starts. They're able to ratify them and deduce that they are not of the intellectual property of other teams and that they are all designed under the regulations correctly. One comment he made that was quite interesting was regarding the issue with brake ducts. Now, last week's episode I mentioned that brake ducts were listed as a standard listed part which could be purchased from another team. However, this year they are not. Now, the problem, this is why Renault picked the brake ducts in particular, because they are of the opinion that those brake ducts are very similar, if not carbon copies, if you like, pun intended, of last year's W10. Now, with that in mind, that would assume that these were designed based on intellectual property belonging to Mercedes, which of course is illegal. He mentioned that this was one of the parts that kind of slipped through the cracks. They didn't actually review or check these because of the change in regulations. So they didn't believe that they were going to end up in a situation where a team would be breaking the rules. Now, of course, Racing Point's defence would simply be, well, we had this intellectual property last season. We can't just forget what we know. And therefore, that's why we've used that to design a piece like brake ducts in this instant to be very similar to what the Mercedes was last year, because we were already aware of it last season when it was legal. So with that in mind, of course, he's mentioned that Racing Point will put forward their case to defend themselves. The FAA and stewards, if they find any wrongdoing, will put their case forward to argue against it, along with Renault and probably other teams that will probably want to know. And I think the key factor in this investigation, Courtney, is that when it does come out, and hopefully sooner rather than later, that if Racing Point is legal, the car's legal, or in the other case, if it's not, what will most likely happen is further investigations will be requested to check the whole car. And that should have...
Yeah, definitely a possibility.
And that will have huge ramifications on Racing Point if that car is deemed to be illegal, i.e., as we mentioned, in some cases, an exclusion from the championship.
And you don't want to see that, regardless of how you feel about certain teams, you want to be seeing as many cars on a grid during a race. So let's hope that doesn't happen.
And this also has further ramifications on potential futures of drivers, one of which, Sebastian Vettel. Once again, Sebastian Vettel linked with Racing Point. Now, of course, we entertained the idea of perhaps Red Bull not really being a door that's fully closed on him, but with Racing Point, that seems to be the most likely seat. Of course, he's been speaking to Otmar Safnauer, he's been speaking to Lawrence Stroll, of course, about the potential for joining Racing Point, which will be Aston Martin next season. And as an exciting prospect that is, this investigation will definitely have huge consequences regarding whether Vettel will want to join them or not. Because of course, if the car is found to be illegal, I don't think Sebastian Vettel is going to want to join a Racing Point car that's 2 years out of development compared to the rest of the field. And,
it hit them massively.
Exactly, and he said himself that he wouldn't want to join a midfield team. He wants to be racing near the front, and at the moment that is the case. But what this means also is the potential where one of the two drivers at Racing Point will have to vacate their seats. Now, I think familiar Formula One fans will know that the chances are that will most likely fall with Sergio Perez losing his seat. Now, Sergio Perez, one of the best drivers in the field, arguably the best driver in the midfield, with the exception perhaps of one or two others, and a driver that has performed well for Racing Point over the years. But I think in a way, because Lance Stroll, and Courtney, you mentioned Lance Stroll a lot and have got praise for him, so obviously it's interesting to hear what you think of this, but I think given how Perez has been seen by the fans and by the media and how well he's done in previous years, it's almost as if we're completely writing off the abilities of Lance Stroll. And quite frankly, I said before in a previous episode that I think Lance should be given a fair chance because, yes, his dad owns the team, or at least runs the consortium that owns the team. He's very much funded his son's progress in the sport, and that's not a dig because loads of drivers get into the sport with funding from one source or another. This one just directly happens to be from his dad, as any good dad would probably do, I'd imagine. And it completely overlooks Lance's abilities, and Lance is a former Formula 3 champion, Euro Series champion, similar award that Valtteri Bottas has won, George Russell, Lando Norris, all good drivers that I've named there. And Lance has been really good this season. Austria, the first race, he was hampered by engine issues, but other than that, he was brilliant in qualifying, and in the race, he was outstanding. It was an excellent performance, and in wet conditions, difficult circumstances, I think it's fair to say he outperformed Sergio Perez, and it's not the first time he's done that in the Racing Point this season.
Well, I'm pleased with the weekend that Lance Stroll had, and I'm pleased for him on a human level, because it doesn't matter how rich or successful you are, you do have thoughts and feelings, and I'm pretty much under the impression that he'll have been receiving a lot of abuse the last week or so, given that there's a lot of pressure on Perez's seat. I saw online the other day that the former president of Mexico started a trend about saving Perez. So that trended. So you can imagine that Stroll would have got a lot of abuse, particularly online. And yeah, I think he's just very much guilty of. He's very much the victim of his family ties. Now I'm going to go into football a little bit, and for those of you who don't know about football, West Ham or anything, I'm sure you know who Frank Lampard is and how a great player he became. When he started off at West Ham, his uncle was the manager at the time, Harry Redknapp, and a lot of the fans felt that he was only getting into the side because of his uncle, and things went sour. He left for a rival, and there's still a bad feeling towards Frank to the day. But what you can't deny is that actually the guy is very talented. You can look at the stats, incredibly gifted, and he was just disregarded because he was related to the manager. And I'm not saying that Lance Stroll is going to go on to be a Frank Lampard of Formula One, but it's a shame to see someone's talent completely forgotten because of who they're related to.
Yeah, and that's always a difficult thing to get over with some of the fans. And this is why I'm glad that we're finally seeing Lance in a very good car, so we can finally see what the kid can do, because he's clearly fast. And even if he's been performing as he has been in qualifying in dry conditions, he's been a tenth or two off of Sergio's pace. That's really not a lot when you consider that Valtteri Bottas is about that much slower on ultimate qualifying pace than Lewis Hamilton most weeks. So, I do think that the money backing does do a disservice to Lance, and I don't think it's enough to say that he's talented enough to be in Formula One. I actually think he's very much earned his seat in Formula One to this point, and definitely deserves to be on the grid. There's definitely worse drivers or poorer performing drivers at the moment than Lance Stroll when you strip it all and adjust them pound for pound how they've performed. He certainly hasn't made too many mistakes as people probably think he has, to be honest. If you look through, he's actually driven rather well since his time at Williams. Of course, the first season was a bit difficult, but he certainly has improved. It's a very difficult decision.
There is a stigma the last few years, and I've been guilty of it. There is a stigma against paid drivers because it is a shame to see talented drivers leave the sport because they don't have the financial backing, and I hate to see it. So that's why there is a bit of a stigma. But it's not going to be the case all the time. There are going to be occasions where the driver can have financial backing and be gifted. It doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. And I feel that's the case with Stroll.
Well, Perez has financial backing as well, as do some other drivers. So, there is that element to it. You can be both. And I think all the drivers have had backing at one way or another. It's just about what you do when you get to Formula One. That's just the nature of the beast. You have to have some level of financial backing, whether you're signed up to a team, whether you're sponsored by local governments or countries or companies, if you like. However it is you get to Formula One, everyone has their route in, and it does involve some level of financial backing. I don't think anyone can get away from that. So we'll have to wait and see, of course. It's a very interesting decision that Racing Point are going to have to make, assuming that Vettel does want to still join them after the investigation, whichever way that goes. And of course, that investigation, we're hearing that the findings may actually come to light sooner than we think. So it might be in the next week or so. It might be the next couple of weeks. We'll have to wait and see. But it's definitely interesting. It's one that's going to run on.
Yeah.
It's going to run on this season.
Let's hope it doesn't, because you kind of want to. We've had enough holding back and what ifs this year. So let's hope we have a smooth season and we know how things are going into the future.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a unique position where 3 or 4 drivers already know that they're going to be moving teams. It's something that we don't normally have this early into an F1 season. Of course, time-wise, it's about right for silly season, of course. Hungary usually being the race that precedes the summer break where it all kicks off. But not this time, of course, for obvious reasons. But we digress on that one. So moving on to Racing Point, who are obviously going from strength to strength at the moment, to a team that, once again, had a very good Saturday, I would say. But not a good Sunday, and that is Ferrari. Now, Ferrari, of course, on Saturday finishing in qualifying, probably as good a qualifying performance as they could have asked for, really. Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc qualifying 5th and 6th respectively in dry conditions, and I think for the first time we finally got to see how good that Ferrari is in ultimate pace and dry conditions. And on the surface, with the engine issues aside, despite being best part of 1.2, 1.3 seconds off the Mercs, probably the best they could have asked for, Courtney, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it was a big step forward from Austria, where they struggled to get through to Q3. You know, and a team as big as Ferrari should not be worrying about getting through to Q3. So yeah, it was definitely a step forward for them. But going into the race, we discussed this previously, Adam, they must have come out of the race itself with mixed emotions.
Yes, and I feel, I mentioned this again in pre-season testing, of course, you know, you did as well, that Ferrari seemed to be alluding to strengths in their race pace. I mean, to be honest, they spent all that time trying to convince us that that's actually how fast they were going. We all thought they were holding back until the horrible realisation that they were actually spot on the money. But that's just the nature of Ferrari. You never believe them in pre-season testing, whether they're the fastest or the slowest. They never seem to show their hand. But unfortunately, it does seem that that's what they were doing. And in the race, this translated as well. I think Ferrari's issues, of course, the car is not fast. It's not drivable at the moment, especially for Sebastian Vettel, who loves a car that's very much drivable.
Yeah.
Having said that, though, Vettel minus 1 or 2 little mistakes at turn 12 earlier on, and then turn 2 when he went a bit wide, both times allowing Alex Albon to overtake him. Finishing 6th was probably the best, one of the most calmer, more composed performances from Sebastian Vettel. But again, I mean, having a slow car is one thing, but once again, Ferrari, their strategy choices and decision making illustrated in 2 moments. First of all, putting Charles Leclerc onto the soft tyres very early into the race, when a lot of F1 fans will know that Hungary is a track notorious for being a one-stopper with mediums to hards, and Ferrari put him on the soft tyres after a few laps, which I thought was brain dead because it left him vulnerable. He wasn't able to use the soft tyres because the track, everyone was on the dry tyres and it was difficult to pass anyway, so the soft tyres were basically irrelevant unless you were out in front. And he was completely nowhere, finishing 11th in the end, considering that he was ahead of Sebastian earlier on in the race after the start. And then the second one was Sebastian Vettel was told also to pit onto the soft tyres like Charles did, and he basically told his engineer, don't you mean the mediums? And then eventually they put him on the mediums, and that's why he finished in 6th place. But as I said, once again, Courtney, Ferrari playing the dunces, if you like, in terms of their strategy. And once again, Vettel showing to have that experience and know-how and, I suppose, confidence, if you like, as an experienced F1 driver, to basically correct his engineers and recommend the correct strategy whilst driving the car at 200 plus miles an hour, which is something Vettel, we've often said, has done too much. But it just shows that Ferrari are not able to operate at least in the right manners, and they keep making these mistakes that they cannot afford to keep making at the moment.
Well, yeah, there are multiple issues at Ferrari, and I've said it a million times on this podcast, there are deep cultural issues within this team. And it just shows with the multiple issues that they have, and strategy is one. They always seem to make high-profile mistakes. And you have got to think, you know, are they going to miss that influence on Vettel? Because he does bring a maturity that might be missed. I'm not saying that signs of being immature or anything, but I don't know, could the influence of Vettel be missed next season? And I'm sure Ferrari will close the gap in terms of raw pace, not completely, but to some extent. But for a team like Ferrari to get lapped, that was I remember watching the commentary on Sky Sports, and when Lewis overtook Vettel, you know, Martin Brundle put it perfectly. He went, this is a significant moment, because it is for Ferrari, you know, multiple world champions, still the most successful team in Formula One, to be lapped. You know, it wasn't like they crashed or anything. Yeah, there was sloppy strategy. It wasn't like they crashed. They got lapped in terms of raw pace, and that must have been a dagger in the heart for Ferrari.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very, very, very difficultly dark moment for Ferrari. I mean, Charles Leclerc, you can obviously say he was a bit out of sync given how poor the strategy was, so you can put that on the team. But Sebastian Vettel, there's no way ends about it. He was lapped on pace. And Lewis Hamilton, as we said often this season, it looks like Mercedes, when Lewis is out in front, he's almost like he's got pace to burn. He doesn't need to use that pace. And Mercedes' biggest problem at the moment seems to be just managing the car. They don't need to extract that full pace, and no one's forcing their hand. If that car outright is a second faster than their next car, which by the looks of it is the Racing Point, which is basically, if you like, their B team almost, given how many Mercedes parts that they do use outside the investigation, it's quite worrying for a team like Ferrari, who we spoke about this off air, that their engine issues has cost them at most tracks at least half a second, in some cases 3/4 of a second. You adjust the delta based on their new car, and they did bring their upgrades, of course, with them. You would say that they would be second fastest, but even then they would be still half a second, 3/4 of a second off the Mercs at best. It's quite worrying times at Ferrari, and I think the problem at Ferrari now is they have this culture up senior management at Maranello, where they do look to get involved in the team's operations more often than perhaps they should. And Mattia Binotto in a position where he is running the show, he's the technical, he's leading the team principal, he's also the head of the technical side at Ferrari. He's too involved. I just feel like the structure at Ferrari is all over the place, and you have Mattia Binotto who's trying to do his best with a position where he was so good in the engine department of Ferrari, he was so good at the technical side at Ferrari, he really helped that team along since their woes back in 2014 and 15 to where they were 2 years ago when they had a championship winning car, to where they are now, where they haven't really replaced him in that regard and put him into a position where he's kind of doing too much. And no team is structured like that. Mercedes aren't structured like that. You've got Toto Wolff, and you've got 3 people underneath him, in James Allison in particular, running the technical side at Mercedes. And you had Paddy Lowe before that, obviously before he moved on. But you've got people there that entrusted to be running their particular departments and let Toto run at the helm, whereas Mattia does not have that level of support. To the point now where Toto Wolff probably considers Ferrari to be a bit of an afterthought. He's done talking about them, and sacking Mattia Binotto, and I agree with these thoughts that he mentioned, sacking Mattia Binotto or replacing him in the way that they've replaced Mattiacci, Stefano Domenicali, Arriva Bene in the past, it's just not going to fix Ferrari's problem.
No, if they get rid of Binotto altogether, then Ferrari are going to have some serious issues.
And I think if we talked about this as well, it's probably worth mentioning, but Ferrari, we've so often said, you say almost on a weekly episode, they are a national institution. So I'm going to get that one in before you. But the problem with this is, whilst it's great to have that identity that Ferrari have that no other team has, this Italian identity, the Scuderia, the Tifosi, all of that, the great things that Formula One love about Ferrari that only they seem to have, it can also come at a price where we've seen great people in the past. James Allison, a great example. When you join Ferrari, you have to uproot your family to Italy. You have to learn the language. You have to embed yourself in the culture. You have to eat, sleep, breathe Ferrari. Now, whilst that can work, and it has done in the past, when you operate under that level of scrutiny and under that sort of system, it can cause the top talents from around the world to be discouraged from that and not want to join them, or worse, they work at Ferrari, develop these great systems, not successful, and then move to other teams. I mean, how many Ferrari personnel over the last 5 years have left them and joined Mercedes? I couldn't even count. So many.
Well, yeah, because I don't think teams leave for Mercedes just because they're the top team. They leave because it's pretty apparent that one of the reasons why Mercedes is so successful is because it's an enjoyable and an emotionally safe place to work. And who doesn't want that? What human being doesn't want to work at a place where they're encouraged and they're allowed to be creative and are allowed to speak if they don't agree with something? Because it's something that's often said in interviews with Mercedes and their drivers, is that they're very vocal with each other. They're very open. If there's an issue, they discuss it and move on from it. And I just get the feeling from I reckon within the team there's a big fear culture. And I think there's a lot of miscommunication, and I don't think issues are dealt with properly. And it's painfully obvious in the races with the decisions they make with strategy and stuff.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And as I said, I do have to mention this because I'm not saying for a second that Ferrari should not shut down the factory in Maranello and build one over Brackley like Mercedes have done. But there is a reason why all the top teams and all of the teams in Formula 1 have a British base, and I think it might help Ferrari to have something like that. Not even if it's like a division of what they have in Maranello. That will not happen, of course. I mean, not even anyone's wildest fantasies. But I think what we've seen as a result of this is now we have a culture at Ferrari where it is discouraging the top people from working there, or if they already have been there, they've moved on to rivals who can bestow their secrets and use those things they've learnt at Ferrari and about their car that's worked so well. I mean, look at the side pod. The famous side pods that Ferrari introduced back in 2017. Almost every car on the grid has them.
Yeah.
And the amount of, and even Mercedes have them now, and those are only things that have been knowledge that's been transferred to other teams from personnel that have left Ferrari to go to these teams. And this isn't me saying that Ferrari don't have the best people in their team. They have very good people working at their team, but perhaps what's costing them year after year is the fact that they are losing people because of the fact that they are so secluded and isolated in this old bubble that they have that really has existed since the likes of Jean Todt, Braun, Schumacher have departed back in the mid-2000s. And this is perhaps why Ferrari have not won a world championship since 2007.
Yeah, I think, we've had the discussion many times. I just feel it's a bit of a loosely used word, but I would say that the atmosphere behind the scenes of Ferrari is pretty toxic, and it has been for quite some time now. I think you even look at Fernando Alonso, the way he behaved. I know he has a bit of a reputation, but his time at Ferrari definitely seemed to bring the worst out in him as well.
Quite possibly. And I think we'll move on to Ferrari now, or from Ferrari I should say, on to, just before we wrap this episode up, just a quick shout out to the Haas team, who, I mean, what a great job that they did. What a brilliant strategy call that was from Haas. I'm not sure if it was Gunther Steiner that called it, or if it was it within the team, but whoever it was, absolutely brilliant job. And for those of you that didn't see, what Haas did at the start of the race, they were starting well down the order at the back. Before the start of the race, they pitted both of their drivers on the formation lap to put on dry tyres, because we were at that point where the Inters were starting to go and the dry tyres were going to be the tyre to be on, despite Max Verstappen's little incident on the form before he even got to the grid, which thankfully they fixed, so well done to Red Bull there. But they basically pitted them onto dry tyres, and after about 4 or 5 laps, everyone else had pitted for the dry tyres, so they were at the front of the field. And
it almost a pit stop, wasn't it, for them?
Exactly, and it was absolutely genius. Of course, the downside is, though, and I should mention this, is that they did get a penalty for this. Both drivers were issued with a 10-second time penalty because they breached Article 27.1, which basically means that the driver has to drive the car alone and cannot be instructed by the engineers on what to do in the race. Now, of course, people saying in response, well, what about Lando Norris with this scenario 7 overtake? That's a bit different. That stuff is permitted. There is a list of stuff that engineers can say, and that's one of them. Whereas the pitting on the formation lap, in terms to box in the race, they're two different things, because obviously the race hasn't started and they're being told to do something they wouldn't have normally done. Now, I think one reason why this would probably hit home is because Danny Kvyat actually did ask his team on the formation lap if he could pit, and they didn't respond, yes or no. So perhaps they were aware that if they did tell him one way or the other, they would get that 10-second time penalty as well. But nonetheless, Kevin Magnussen and Grosjean had a bit of damage, which cost him a bit later on. But Magnussen still finished in the points. He finished in 10th, which is Haas's first point of the season. And
it could be an important point as well.
Absolutely. I mean, given how short the season could well be, we've got 10 confirmed races with perhaps a few more to be confirmed in the near future, with rumours about Imola and Hockenheim surfacing potentially. I heard Matt Macy was going to Imola to have a look at that for a potential race in October, so that's promising as well. A third race in Ferrari country. I can't remember the last time we've had that in a Formula 1 season, but it's definitely becoming, as I predicted, a very European championship. But nonetheless, great job from Haas. And it's moments like that, those bits of genius, which I really do enjoy in Formula 1. I think we do not see enough of, especially in this era. So hopefully we'll see a bit more of that. But yeah, I think we've pretty much covered everything for the review of the Hungarian Grand Prix, Courtney, wouldn't you say?
Very, very happy with the job we've done today.
Great. And I hope you guys are too, of course, listening to it. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts so far. I mean, we're 20 episodes in, and I'm loving recording these every week. I know we say this a lot, but we really genuinely are enjoying this, and we're so glad this season's underway because we've got stuff to talk about. No preview, of course, of the British Grand Prix. That is not until the weekend after this. The weekend beginning of August. So, of course, we've got the double header coming up. We've got the British Grand Prix, and then we've got the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, which is also at Silverstone. So, just giving it a different name. That's what they do.
Great circuit. Always delivers great racing.
Yes, and
it's definitely in my top 3 of the season.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And once again, I'm expecting the next chapter in the battle between Hamilton and Bottas in this season's champion. I'm hoping that Bottas can perform like he did in Austria, because Hamilton obviously has got the upper hand at the moment. The last couple of races he's been very, very strong, and Bottas, the odd little mistake has crept into his driving a little bit. So I'm just hoping that that can be eradicated rather than it fall apart like it did in 2019 last season. But nonetheless, as I said once again, thank you very much for tuning in. Of course, make sure to like, share and subscribe to us if you're listening to us on YouTube. And of course, if you're listening to us on your favourite podcasting platform, whatever that may be, we're literally everywhere these days. Make sure to like and download and share this with your friends as well if you've got any Formula 1 enthusiasts as well. And of course, once again, we should point out and plug, we've got the first part of the DNF1 Beginner's Guide to Formula 1 airing on Friday the 24th of July, first thing in the morning wherever you are around the world. So make sure to check that out only on the YouTube channel, I'm afraid. So if you do listen to us on your podcasting platforms, you will only be able to see that video on YouTube. So make sure to check that out as well. And of course, follow us on social media. We're a DNF1_podcast. That is on Twitter and Instagram, in particular Instagram, because Courtney put some great stuff over the weekend and throughout the week as well, as that you can interact with as well. So make sure to follow.
You're too kind, Adam. You're too kind.
Well, I've got to give you a thumbs up where I can, Courtney. You do a lot of work on that, and it should be noted. And the fans will definitely enjoy that as well. So hopefully we can get more people involved in that and engaged and produce more content in the future. And I think that pretty much covers it for this episode. We've run over a little bit, but I think we'll be okay. And all that's left to say is thank you very much once again, Courtney, for co-hosting this episode with me.
Yeah, enjoyed it yet again, mate. Things are going well. Let's keep it up.
Brilliant. And of course, I've been Adam Burns, your other host on this episode. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 podcast.
See you soon.